the uterus is our first home. You know, we always have very fond memories of mere bachpan ka ghar. This is your OG bachpan ka ghar. When we think of a gynecologist in India, we usually think कोई भी women's health issue है तो gynecologist के पास जाना है. Headache हो रहा है, you're a woman, gynecologist के पास जाओ. I'm very interested in sexual wellness. I'm very interested in reproductive wellness. Right. And that wellness concept kind of is missing from healthcare in our country, unfortunately, at the moment. When I was growing up, Raja Hindustani had come out, and that one small kiss scene जो इतना दूर से shoot किया है, as the actors are coming closer, camera और दूर जा रहा है. So you can kind of make out that there's, you know, kissing happening, versus now when Gehraiyan ka trailer came out, which is just a make-out montage. Yeah. So we're like, you know, that whole conversation is evolving and pushing forward now, which is changing people's mindsets as well, hopefully.
Do you want to use the platform to tell us who needs the vaccine, how we can get it?
So the HPV vaccine is a vaccine that is available to everybody now in India. Anybody over the age of 9, under the age of 45. This subset can get it. The earlier you get it, the more protected you are.
Dr. Tanaya Narendra is a doctor who is educated in Oxford, an author with a book that's just about to come out, and of course a specialist in reproductive health. But she also has 1 million followers on Instagram under the name Dr. Cuterus, where she answers questions about reproductive health, about genitalia, about sex toys, about safe sex, things that nobody will talk to young people about. She sits down with me in a conversation today where we talk about everything that's taboo and how she became the go-to person to answer all the taboo questions. Listen in. Thank you for making the journey and speaking to us. I'm normally grateful that people have come to Chembur, but you've come in all the way from Allahabad, so I'm really grateful.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Dr. Cuterus, where did the name come from? What's the story behind the name?
I was very drunk in a pub when I was a young student. I mean, honestly, I was originally called Uterosaurus Rex because that was my favorite dinosaur and I thought it was a nice wordplay. But then I realized that people can't quite spell it, so it was difficult for discoverability. And the uterus is our first home. You know, we always have very fond memories of mere bachpan ka ghar. This is your OG bachpan ka ghar, and yet we look at it from an angle of, I suppose shame is the right word. Yeah. Disgust. It's something that needs to be cleansed. Yeah. Detoxification. I hate that, politely put. And I felt like we needed sort of a different view of this magical organ. It's pure magic. And it's, yeah, I suppose it was cute and uterus and the sense of home and all of that put together.
Very nice. So, are you a qualified gynecologist or a sex expert? What is the background here that makes you Dr. Cuterus?
I did medical school.
Yes.
After that, I did a master's in fertility treatments because I was really interested in becoming a fertility doctor, and then eventually the plan was to do gynecology. And yet somewhere along the line I realized my training was put on hold because of the pandemic, and then in that 2 or 2.5 years time I realized maybe I don't want to be a gynecologist. Because gynecology in India is extremely birth focused.
Yes.
And there's a lot more that I want to do and I see myself doing instead of just deliveries. And I mean,
so actually tell us that difference between a gynecologist and an OB.
So an obstetrician is the one who deals with deliveries and complications and, you know, all of the pre and post pregnancy stuff. A gynecologist would do other things as well. So adolescent care, menopausal care, maybe non-surgical stuff as well, endocrine or like hormonal health. When we think of a gynecologist in India, we usually think कोई भी women's health issue है तो gynecologist के पास जाना है. Headache हो रहा है, you're a woman, gynecologist के पास जाओ. Yeah, very often.
Really?
Yeah, very often. I suppose it's a smaller city problem more than in metros, but
ladies type का problem.
Ladies doctor, that's the word.
Ladies doctor.
And yeah, and the problem is कि ladies doctor is well and good, but ladies को doctor के पास सिर्फ तभी क्यों जाना है जब बच्चा हो रहा है, you know, there's other things in life. And that's why I kind of struggle with that identity.
So actually, from looking at your Instagram, right, so you do talk a lot about women's health, but there's so much about sex as well. Is that because there's a gap that the questions came to you and you decided to start answering them? How did that journey, from where you started off to where you are right now, was it deliberate that you will talk about sex and the taboo things that nobody else is talking about?
I think so. I mean, I've always been interested in this particular side of medicine, like reproductive health, sexual health, menstrual health. Unfortunately, there is no specialization for sexual health in India.
Wow.
There exists no degree like that. So,
does it exist overseas?
In the US, absolutely, very nicely. In the UK, there's a genito-urinary medicine speciality, which is extremely siloed. I mean, there's a very small scope you have in terms of what you're going to look at. I'm very interested in sexual wellness. I'm very interested in reproductive wellness.
Right.
And that wellness concept kind of is missing from healthcare in our country, unfortunately, at the moment. Which I suppose it's just my passion project. These are things I am interested in as a doctor. And it so happens that we don't talk about these enough, so people do have a lot of questions. Yeah, it's probably that.
So, okay. And I'll come back to the fact that you went to Oxford and then came back, and then did your parents be like, what is this? And now you're an Instagram influencer? You like Oxford छोड़ के तुम Instagram कर रही हो क्या है? Like, was that a question at home?
कभी-कभी जब थप्पड़ मारना होता है तो ऐसे मारते हैं.
Folks are doctors, right?
Yes, fertility doctors, both of them.
And so are they asking what you're doing all day?
I still practice. I'm still practicing as a doctor. This is still my side hustle.
Okay.
And
wow, it's a very impressive side hustle.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. She starts seeing value in it. My mom, my dad is just like, jo karna hai karo, tumhari zindagi hai. My mom starts seeing value in it most of the times, but then suddenly she'll be like, "Arey, par doctor kahan hai ye?" Because again, another thing that happens in India, public health is not something we think of as a doctor's job, which fully is, 100% is. But ये सब थोड़ी होता है, जिनका practice नहीं चलता है वो public health में जाते हैं. That's the kind of general idea and perception we have. So थोड़ी बहुत इज्जत मिल जाती है कभी-कभी, हमेशा नहीं.
Okay, so let's actually, as two women on a podcast, let's set it all aside and actually deal with the taboos. What is the question you receive the most from your audience that surprised you?
It's actually very disheartening.
Oh.
It's about body image. Across the board, everybody, the most common question is always, are my boobs too big? Are they too small? They're too saggy. My penis is too small. My genitals are too dark. My skin is flabby. I have stretch marks. It just breaks my heart every time I read it, because how have we, humans are magnificent in all of their glory, but how have we made people feel so disgusting in their own bodies? And I feel like a lot of it is centered around the aesthetic of how we're supposed to look.
That's actually, yes, that is pretty disheartening. And so obviously it's linked in some way to the lack of pleasure or the lack of ability to give pleasure if you don't fit into that idea of what you're supposed to look like.
I have another disheartening addition to this. I feel like pleasure is not really a priority in the conversation. It's about sex must be done, It's a thing. We live in a very hypersexual, sex is something that's sold as something very aspirational, right? But people have such difficult ideas कि मुझे ऐसा दिखना चाहिए या मुझे ऐसा होना चाहिए. There seems to be almost a prerequisite कि अगर ऐसे आप नहीं दिखते हैं या अगर आप ऐसे present नहीं करते हैं, then you should not be having sex. So first it's almost like it's an achievement thing that sex has been had.
Yeah.
And then eventually pleasure comes into the focus. It's also how we view sex in popular culture, from like pornography in particular. It's very perfect bodies, very digitally enhanced bodies. And the idea is it's a performance, how long can you last and how dramatic, how many pretzel-like poses can you contort yourself into. It's very theatrical, and essentially that's what it's meant to be, right? It's a form of entertainment. It's not sex ed. But people learn that and try to imbibe that.
Because that's where they're learning from. They're learning from pornography.
I do believe so, yeah. Mostly. I learned most of my sex ed from porn until I went to medical school.
So, is it still, and you said that sex in India is portrayed as an aspirational thing, something to aspire to. Is that both you find for men and women, or do you find the women, I mean, for women still there's an aspect of shame perhaps attached to premarital sex, or, you know, to pleasure even?
To demand pleasure is somehow undignified. Or and there's slut shaming, very rampant slut shaming. I don't know if I have the privilege of being able to speak to a subset that is probably either leaving this particular angle of shame behind when they're talking to me about certain things, or is it that they have evolved and we as a community and as a society are evolving, and, you know, they've truly left that behind, not just in this particular conversation. But in the conversations I've been having of late, I feel like it's aspirational for everybody.
That's good to hear, though.
In an odd sort of way, yes.
Because I always got the feeling that there was a double standard that way, in the sense that for men, for young men, unmarried young men, it was something to brag about, and for unmarried young women, it was something to hide.
Oh, that still is there.
That's still there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But at least among themselves, is there less of an idea of shame?
I suppose in private conversations, it's still okay. I mean, again, I don't know if this is that particular privilege or what, but there's a lot of shame. It's also the fact that I'm speaking to a very particular kind of audience, you know. English speaking, who has access to a phone and who's able to talk about the idea of having sex, or is consuming that sort of content. See, I mean, TV and media has changed also so much. What I always say is, when I was growing up, Raja Hindustani had come out, and that one small kiss scene, jo itna dur se shoot kiya hai. As the actors are coming closer, camera aur dur ja raha hai. So you can kind of make out that there's, you know, kissing happening, versus now when Gehraiyan ka trailer came out, which is just a make-out montage. So we're like, you know, that whole conversation is evolving and pushing forward now, which is changing people's mindsets as well, hopefully. Fingers crossed, I guess.
And when you practice, and your practice is, I'm assuming, in Allahabad, do you find women still nervous about the questions they can and cannot ask their doctor? Do you find young people, perhaps in a place like Allahabad, more open to talking about pleasure, to talking about sex, to talking about, you know, actually being able to ask the questions they want to ask?
I've never had anybody come to me to talk to, like, physically in the clinic to talk about pleasure. Online consultations, yes.
Okay.
Never in person, ever.
Wow.
Yeah. This is full of disheartening realizations.
Okay, tell me a heartening realization. Something that you were actually, okay, that's cool. I didn't realize that.
So many people are getting vaccinated against HPV.
Excellent.
I feel like that's the best thing I've seen in my life. Like, you know, hopefully, I truly pray and hope we can get to a future where we're able to get rid of cervical cancer as a concept in our country, considering the amount of burden we have of cervical cancer. More women in India die from cervical cancer than any other country. So it's a real problem, and there's preventative strategies available. We just don't implement them, because anything to do with women's sexuality is dirty and should never be touched.
So I met a gynecologist who told me that if you are monogamous, then you don't need the vaccine. Do you agree? Do you want to use the platform to tell us who needs the vaccine, how we can get it?
Absolutely, yes.
Go ahead.
So the HPV vaccine is a vaccine that is available to everybody now in India. In December, we were supposed to get a lower cost vaccine available. I don't know what the progress on that is. It's Swadeshi from the Serum Institute. However, while that's not there, there is still another vaccine that's available. Unfortunately, it costs 10,000 rupees a dose. There's 3 doses. Anybody over the age of 9, under the age of 45, this subset can get it. It's also available for men in India now since September 2021. And the earlier you get it, the more protected you are, because HPV is something you get from sexual contact. So it's not necessary that you have to have sex or penetration. Even touch can transmit HPV. And of course, yes, as you're growing older, you're getting more and more exposed. So your likelihood of getting HPV is higher. But I mean, technically, yes, if you're monogamous, you don't need it. But in the real world, cheating happens. People split up from their partners. And, if it's an affordable option, everybody should get it, is what I say. But if it's not an affordable option, I will tell monogamous couples to skip it.
Okay. So if you can afford it, you should just go out and get it. Everybody should go out.
Line up outside the hospitals like we line up outside Apple stores for new iPhones.
Everybody should get your HPV vaccination. Do you have a lot of men writing to you online?
My significantly larger subset is women. I would say like 70-30 almost. But yes, it's a very curious split, because half the men that write to me are very nice and positive and actually asking nice engaging questions, but the other half are dick pics.
You're just sending you dick pics?
Just randomly open your email and you're like, hello. It's beautiful.
For what?
People get Uncle K Phul wale good morning messages. I get dick pics.
So basically, there's someone who opens up their Instagram or their social media and they see this doctor giving advice, and they're like, let me just send her a picture of my dick.
Some people take the extra effort of sending me an email. But yeah, pretty much that.
And there's no question, there's no nothing.
No, just here, hello.
There's no like, is this the right size?
I have turned up, look at me, my glory, my entitlement, it's here.
Of the online consultations that you do you sort of find that, and you did say that younger people right now are perhaps more willing to talk about, more willing to ask their questions. There's a little more sort of in private, at least, openness to having this conversation. Very different from, say, about maybe 10-15 years ago, where you just ask your friends and you'd walk away with information that's perhaps just as bad as yours. But if you were to use the platform to give out advice, what would that advice be, going by the most number of questions you have received in that area?
Oh, your body is fine as it is. There's no need for any modification or, porn is a lie. Use a condom for every sexual act that's there and get vaccinated against HPV. I'm like, I will harp on until your ears bleed about HPV. But I feel like public health is a conversation that we tend to miss, unfortunately, very often in medicine. And this is such a simple tool, so simple. एक jab, मतलब 3 jab लगवाने हैं, but एक jab ही तो है यार.
Yeah.
And it's so dramatic in its impact, small steps, world-changing steps.
Why do you feel people are reluctant to?
I think there's a couple of problems with it. The first is there's a huge anti-vax community at the moment.
Okay.
So
in India also?
And the facts are all wrong. When the COVID vaccine came out, I was making some reels about it, and people are like, ये बिकी हुई है, mRNA क्या करता है body में, तुम्हें पता है? I'm like, A, India में mRNA vaccine नहीं है. B, everybody has mRNA in their bodies. Yeah. So the information is so flawed that they're thinking, ये हम mRNA vaccine India में बना रहे हैं. So it may just be, people seeing stuff on the internet and getting influenced. I don't know. There's a significant community in India as well, unfortunately, already. The other thing is that anything that has to do with women's sexuality is questioned. Or women's bodies, actually, for that matter, is questioned. And there's this sort of moral panic almost that, if you get people vaccinated against this STI, people are going to go start banging everything left, right and center, and it's the ultimate demise of the good girl. So
wow.
It's good old historical misogyny at play.
I hadn't even considered that. Wow, really?
It's really interesting, because a lot of funding for these kind of campaigns comes from conservative religious groups, where they're wanting to limit
Overseas, but in India?
No, but it sort of trickles down here as well, right? Just the tentacles are very far-reaching.
Okay. Also, I'm assuming because a large chunk of the young women who have to get the vaccine are still in their parents' care. In India, longer than 18, and so it takes a little longer to be able to access, something with that kind of money.
No, but it used to be cheaper. So, what my mom used to say, because my mother has a very different sort of patient demographic than I do. So, mama always used to say कि बेटी को शादी में एक साड़ी कम देना, 6,000 रुपए इधर लगा दो, साड़ी एक extra दे दो, and always make sure you're getting vaccinated before शादी. Now 2,000 rupees now is still okay, for somebody to afford that. But what I always say because I get a lot of younger patients, I always say कि cancer का टीका है. Because that's the only way it will make the impact that that it's meant to make. Otherwise, if you say it's HPV का vaccination है, इतने virus होते हैं, एक और हो जाएगा. That kind of ideology we still have. And the minute they start reading about it, they realize that, of course, it's sexual in nature.
Yeah.
So, you have to present it in a certain way. I mean, I'm not misrepresenting a fact when I'm saying ye cancer ka tika hai, but it's a little bit, it's 2 steps ahead, the fact that it's a cancer ka tika. It's essentially an HPV ka tika. So, you have to change the way you're presenting this information. Do you not I suppose it's completely different for you as a journalist, but you have to change the way you're presenting information to make sure you're not alarming people. Is that something you experience?
We put a trigger warning before we put out that information, but I can't really change details or withhold details of information. If it's upsetting, it's upsetting. The best we can do is put out a trigger warning so that someone who's already distressed doesn't watch it and distress themselves further. I have been told by some people that the trigger warning actually makes them watch it because now they're curious. That's not what it's supposed to do. Yeah, it is. It's not what it's supposed to do. But we had Dr. Aparna Hegde on this podcast, and she was telling us stories about women's health that required trigger warnings on our podcast, which I've not had to do before. And she scarred some members of my team also. So, do you find also that people don't take this seriously enough? The unprotected sex, the lack of information, the lack of sort of sources from which one can have these conversations actually leading to detrimental health?
I think sex and STIs have had so much more of a significant impact on the world than we realize, simply because we don't discuss it. From everything from like fashion, because say the idea of merkins, which are pubic hair wigs, which stemmed from, and now there's this whole trend of vajazzling and dyeing your pubic hair and cutting it into shapes. The idea of merkins came from a time.
I love that.
So beautiful.
It is. It should be.
It came from a time, the idea of merkins came from a time when, STIs are still shameful, but it was super shameful to have an STI. So what sex workers would do was they would shave their pubic hair so that, they're not getting any lice, because it's going to happen. And the standard of beauty at that time was to have pubic hair. So then they would buy these merkins and put it on so nobody would know that, this is not your real hair. And now that merkin from 600 years ago is now led to people literally bedazzling their vulva, So this is such a simple concept of how STIs and sex have changed the world and have led such a huge impact on how we view the world. And Bridgerton fashion is so heavily influenced by concealing pockmarks, from syphilis. Yes. Things like that. So we unfortunately just forgot to talk about it somewhere along the line. And I'm not of the camp, I don't believe in fear sells very well. You would know that better than anybody else. But I don't believe that it's a good impetus for people to push them towards better health. I believe making them aware about, it's probably a little utopian for me to think that, but people to actually understand ki these are your risks, these are your benefits. Now this is your decision. My job as a healthcare provider is not to make decisions on the behalf of people. My job is to give them information. What they do with the information is entirely up to them.
Right.
So the way we've talked about STIs and the dangers of unprotected sex and stuff has been very horror film-esque.
Yes.
It's not been an empowering conversation, and the minute you disenfranchise people of that decision-making ability and you put horror in their minds, you're already not doing your job. I feel. So it's a long convoluted way of saying I'm not a big fan of the way we talk about the dangers of STIs right now or unprotected sex, and there are different ways to do it. We need to find those ways.
Do you find that by using social media, and you use Instagram extensively, that's a good way to communicate right now? That it's like you're managing to reach a lot of people, you're managing to talk, you're talking about anal sex, you're talking about sex toys, you're talking about protection, you're talking about, I found a really interesting video on your page of just how to use tissue paper and how not to, whether or not you can pick up a UTI. Stuff that, is now, you're effectively mass communicating to over 1 million people. Is that a good way to do what you're doing, which is put out information on what the risks are and how to be safe?
I think Instagram is a very democratic medium. Everybody has access to it. It's free. हमारे देश में सबसे बढ़िया तो free है. कोई paywall नहीं है. Everybody has a phone. Everybody has an internet connection. We're one of the largest video consumers in the world. We're also we have the cheapest data in the world. मैं अभी spent a year in America. I used to bang my head in the wall every day. कितना पैसा देती हूँ मैं internet का. So, is there a better medium? People don't like to read.
Not anymore.
TV सबके घर में होता नहीं है. Phone सबके हाथ में है. YouTube requires a lot of production quality, which honestly I don't have the time for. ये है बैठे हुए हैं कार में बैठे वीडियो बना दिया. How much does it take really? Because these are conversations I'm having all the time. This is literally my bread and butter. Yeah. So I don't have to think about a script. I don't have to think about video design करना है. Here's a question. This is the answer. ये लो कार में बैठे हैं 15 मिनट है वीडियो गया. It is easy for me. It is easy for people to consume, and I feel like that's the best one can do really. I mean, without.
There is an interesting pattern of consumption of video, right? Whether when watching television, people are a little conscious because you have family members in the room or walking in and out of the room, right? So you're really conscious about what you'll watch on that screen. But when you're looking at it on your phone, you can watch something extremely private.
That's brilliant.
And you don't have to necessarily share it with anybody unless you choose, say, hey, you know what, I saw this. Rest of the time you've got your headphones in, and nobody's going to walk in technically on whatever it is you're seeing. So the mobile phone tends to be far more private consumption of video than any other platform up till now.
I love that. I've never thought of that.
Which is also possibly why people are consuming also more readily, because they can do it's just theirs. They can do it alone. They can do it in private.
The phone has also become an extension of our arm at this point. You're always kind of attached to it. It's the way it sits in your hand is almost like forearm ki thickness ka hai. So there's no distinction between your hand and your phone. So you're always constantly attached to it, and we're always looking at stuff. Like, it's just bombardment of information. So why not?
Do you put out a video for every question that you receive, or is there at what point do you decide, okay, this merits a video? Enough people have asked me about it at this point?
Exactly that. When enough people ask.
Yeah.
Also, sometimes people just ask me incredible questions that I haven't thought of, because there's a certain way you see things, and there's a certain way somebody else will see that exact thing. Because I grew up in a doctor household, these things have been very ingrained in me. I know I know from since I was 10 years old the way the uterus sits in the body, because दिन भर यही सुनते थे, यही देखते थे घर में, हर picture, हर model dinner करते हुए video देख रहे हैं, you know, like stuff like that. So I know why you need to put a tampon in like that and not like that, because the vagina is angled backward and the uterus is sitting like this. Okay, like this. Sorry.
Over there.
Oh, sorry, like this. But for somebody who's never used a tampon, who's not engrossed in the depths of the vagina all day long, they would go like this, right? And it would never make sense to them that you need to go like this, and that's why tampon insertions can be painful and they can stick out and they can hang out, and you know, all things can go wrong. That perspective, I suppose, is where I decide to make a lot of videos. कि ये मुझे पता है ऐसा है, because you know, I've read about it and I've learned about it, but that doesn't mean this is common information.
You know, I had someone message me when they knew I was having a conversation with you, saying, I want to, and you sort of answered that question a little bit, saying, I want to understand what things were like in her house when she was growing up, because this individual said, when I first got my period, it was a hush-hush thing. My dad suddenly got really awkward. I didn't know such a thing existed until I got it myself. And I was told to lie at school and say I had a wedding to attend for 3 days, and that's why I can't come in. So, and you know, it sounded, I remember a lot of this shrouding in, like, you know, secrecy of the period when we were in middle school. You obviously grew up in a very different household, but you radically, but school would have been, I'm assuming, you would have come across girls who were growing up in more shrouded.
I went to a convent girls' school.
Oh, welcome.
It's like a generation of people who just wake up with the weirdest ideas in their head because school.
Yes.
It's so strange, you know, the kind of
there's a kinship of women who've done
shared trauma.
Shared trauma. Yes. And then it takes you like 10 years to sort of just like rise, like lift your head above all of that. But then that must have been like different for you, right? From home and school being completely different about.
I didn't become Cuterus. I was always Cuterus. Let's put it this way.
Okay.
I was always that person that people would ask these, because mummy papa doctor hai. Adi kisi ko problem hai, they'll come to my mom. It's a small city. I mean, it's not a small city, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It was always, maybe I never got to see that side really a lot in terms of, at least in school, because it was expected that I will be talking about this, I will be answering these questions, or if I will not be asking them, somebody will be like, apni mummy se puch ke batana, ya apni mummy se dawai dilwa dena. Where I did struggle was, if I'm eating a painkiller on my period for period pain, mat karo, bachcha nahi hoga aage. Like, that's my only job in life. But you know, like, I know what I'm doing. My parents are doctors. I've been prescribed this medicine by a doctor because I am in debilitating pain. This is where I would really struggle with people, where they would come and sort of enforce their ideas onto me. But other than that, I think I haven't, maybe it's that girl school kinship that happens when you start having these conversations where it's not as taboo, really. I did hear about a girl who, a friend of a friend, who when she got her first period thought she was dying, and she wrote this lamba sa chitti to her parents, I'm sorry, I think I have cancer and I'm going to die, and I'm so sorry, I don't know what I've done. Poor thing, I feel so bad even now. So of course, you get these off stories like that, but generally, itna shame, maybe how I hear it in a lot of households, maybe people never told me. I'm not saying it didn't exist. Were there like a particular set of myths that were therein where you grew up, where you lived? Were there some very particular things?
So, let me see. So, when I was in middle school, and this is normally, standard 6, 7 is when everybody's getting their period. Nobody talked about it. I mean, I grew up in a household where I have 2 older sisters. So my mom was sort of like waiting to catch me because she'd been through this twice already. But I distinctly remember this convent school thing where they put in this dustbin in our bathrooms for sanitary napkins. And then it was like a hush-hush thing where the teacher called one girl and said, do you know who else gets their period? Because it wasn't the whole class at that point. And they said, oh, I've seen this person, I've seen that person. And they had to like call out like a small group of us and tell us in secret that this is what this particular dustbin is for. Almost as if they didn't want to sort of corrupt the rest of the class that hadn't gotten there yet. So there was a shroud of secrecy on it. And but I think that when you treat it like that, it automatically becomes something to be ashamed of, right? When you don't want to, when it's all hushed tones and it's like, okay, we want to communicate this information, but we're only going to communicate it to the confirmed suspects, not to the whole class. So we don't want to corrupt the whole lot, just those who are already corrupt in some way. So starting from there and onwards, I mean, the other thing I remember about school in high school was we were called aside and given this very traumatic lecture about how abortion is wrong in the 8th standard. In the 8th standard, and how the only route to avoiding an abortion is abstinence.
Avoid men like the plague.
Avoid men like the plague. No, I remember this one nun who told us that men only want one thing, you should never talk to them. Like literally, I'm quoting word for word. And we were in the 8th standard, right? We were like, they showed us, at that point we had slideshows, right? There were no computers.
Projector
slideshows of mangled remains of fetuses after abortions to scar us into never having one. And I asked, we didn't realize back then, and I am very old, back then we didn't question the school system that much, right? So I, many years later, asked my mother, did you know that they did this? And my mom said no. So there was no parental consent to putting we were effectively kids, we're putting the kids through this process. They just choose to do it, and I thought it was horrific. I remember it to this day. It was horrific.
And to expose a mind as young as that to something so impactful, it's
wrong, it's a sin, it's all of those things, and then it feels pain and you're mangling it. It was horrific.
It's very interesting we're talking about this particular topic because in my the past 1 year I was living in the US while I was finishing my book. I lived in Texas, most reproductively wonderful place in the world. And I live near the state capitals, so wonderful on more levels. And
I'm tempted to say why, but we'll get to that later.
Let's not go there. I have a very interesting collection of swag that has been collected over the years from different brands, So I have this one particular sweatshirt that says, touch it, lick it, suck it, fuck it, on the back. Bada bada, ekdam bold, hot pink color mein. I was wearing that particular sweatshirt on this day and I'm walking with my dog and I'm just like enjoying a nice February day. I see a big protest, big gathering at the Capitol. I walk in there, dekhne kya ho raha hai. Andar ka Hindustani to curious hai ye. I walked around the whole place not knowing what's happening, and then when I walked out I realized it was an anti-abortion rally where I'm just walking around with my fuck it sweatshirt. And when you walk outside you see people holding all of these big posters showing mangled remains or showing late-term abortions that are happening as a medical disaster as opposed to people actually opting for it, where things, say a miscarriage or, things that are not supposed to be happening are happening. It's a very unfortunate instance. And they would take these images and, just...
Yeah, use it as cautionary tales.
Put these dirty messaging on it, like, this is a sin and, you're doing something very horrible. Murder. Abortion is murder. And I also happened to be there when Roe v. Wade was overturned. The day I was writing my chapter on abortions, actually, very interestingly. And it just, the way some people see it and the way some people talk about it is it's a disservice to humanity.
Yeah.
The way we talk about such sensitive and impactful things.
So when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I wrote a column here, and I was talking about, while India has far more progressive abortion laws that give women access to safe abortions with proper qualified doctors, our sense of morality actually completely prevents women from accessing any of those rights, because premarital sex is not okay in India. And so if a girl winds up pregnant, she's going to have to try and figure out how to access a doctor who's not going to be in some way connected back to her parents, or to her masi, or to her bua, or to her bua ki baji ki, somebody who says, "Hey, wo to aayi thi yahan pe." So just that fear then drives young women, and they're doing this alone because they're afraid to tell anybody, drives them to quacks who then do completely unauthorized procedures which are dangerous, mortally dangerous. You could die of these things. Have you encountered a lot of this? Is it really scary in your line of work?
I think the very first time I learned about unsafe abortions was, of course, you all hear it, but the first time I saw it, I think I must have been in 3rd year or 4th year of medical school, and there was this patient that came in with a complaint of primary infertility, which means she has never been able to have a child. She's been trying. Secondary infertility is when you've been able to get pregnant and then now you're struggling. She had primary infertility, and it didn't make sense. Like, the semen was fine. From her basic ultrasound reports, everything looked fine. And then we did a procedure called a hysteroscopy, where you take a camera and then you go into the uterus to see what's up.
Exactly.
Why is this not working? There were tiny bones inside there, because this poor girl had had an unsafe abortion when she was younger, and she couldn't tell anybody. And the most haunting thing of that interaction was that she would sit there in every consultation and cry that, I have failed in some way because I'm not able to become a mother, because I so desperately want to become a mother. And in all of those very private conversations, she never found it an environment safe enough to be able to say that this has happened. And then, of course, we were now confused that you have to write this on her report. You can't, medical legally you must. Yeah. But how do you also shield her from her family and whatever the consequences of this are going to be? Because just the immense sense of failure she felt in herself, that's when you realize that the ground reality is very different from what the law says.
Yeah.
And I will still die on this hill that, especially after living in the US in that particular time, that our laws are very progressive, and in this particular regard, and you have the ability to make that decision. And what I'm afraid of is that people will hear that it's so challenging and then run away from safe abortions, or maybe get exploited. So many times people are told कि unmarried लोगों के लिए ज़्यादा पैसा लगेगा, तुम्हारा 15,000 में होएगा, married के लिए 8,000 में होएगा. So many of my patients have told me this. So that exploitation, that's what I'm afraid of.
Because they know that you can't go to anybody, and so
Extortion.
I can extract whatever I want out of you.
Straight up extortion.
And it's invariably the girls, the women, right, who are doing this on their own, because there's no accountability for the man involved.
Makes me very angry.
It's okay to be angry.
I suppose anger changes the world. Angry women change the world.
Angry women change the world. That is true. We were actually having a conversation with Kubra Seth on the same podcast, who was brave enough to talk about an abortion. And she talked about how there were feelings of shame, there were feelings of, this is sinful, this is a life, I might never get pregnant again. And that's the question I actually want to ask you. This idea, and you did say that someone who's had an unsafe abortion couldn't conceive the second time, but this idea that if you have an abortion, you can't get pregnant again, it will impede your ability, your fertility in the future. Or if you have a certain number, how much of this is true?
Most of it is not true. Again, it comes back to how safely the abortion has been performed, but abortions that are performed and all surgeries have complications. But in a general setting, abortions are very safe. They don't lead to infertility or subfertility or problems conceiving in the future. It does not make the uterus weak. But with all of this said, we do have to remember that it has to be performed by somebody who's trained in performing them. And even then, of course, things can go wrong, but by and large, abortion is a very safe, one of the safest medical procedures out there.
Also, up till a certain week, a certain number of weeks, it's just, you can just take a tablet, right? Is that correct?
In India, it's up to 9 weeks. In certain parts of the world, it's up to 13 weeks. But it's not just it's not just like the age. It's also like your medical status and things like that. But yes, it can be as, maybe simple is not the right word, as uncomplicated as popping 2 tablets. And okay, not 2 kinds of tablets in different numbers, and experiencing a significantly painful period. Without actually having to go to a hospital and getting, sedated and, all that scary hospital stuff.
Yeah. But provided you catch it in time. And you make the decision, the pregnancy in time, and then you make your decision in time. So within 9 weeks, it can just be a couple of tablets and you don't have to actually go into a procedure.
It can be, but in a lot of places, it's not very safe to do. Okay. If there's any underlying medical conditions, if it depends on where the pregnancy has implanted. So if it is, normally all pregnancies go inside the uterus, right? The stuff on the sides of the uterus, we've got 2 little tubes like this. Sometimes this pregnancy can leak out of the uterus from these tubes and either get stuck in the tube or even float around in the abdomen. The craziest I've seen is in the liver. It went and attached to the liver and started growing there, and I think they diagnosed it at like some odd 18 weeks or something like that, like quite advanced. So this is an ectopic pregnancy where just taking the pill alone won't solve the problem, and also can lead to very significant issues and can even be fatal in some cases, which is why it's so important that this be done under the supervision of
a qualified professional,
of a healthcare provider. Yeah.
So, and so for me, I've always found that even in our laws, one of the fundamental things we miss in India is the idea of female pleasure. Which is why this, even legally, when we talk about rape, there's an idea of honor, there is an idea of, the agency of this individual with their own body and their mind and their ability to say yes or no, their ability to accept pleasure, their ability to enjoy it, their ability to want it, is completely denied by our society on all levels. And so we only consider that women will have sex within the institution of marriage in order to have babies, even today. And because most of our society looks at it that way, because most of our society, I think that's where we get stuck on so many things.
I'll tell you something very interesting. The word vagina, it means a sheath. It makes me so angry. I love the vagina, but it's reduced to a receptacle for this massive and magnificent penis sword,
Yeah.
And this is still, unfortunately, this is an upgrade from what it was, because originally, the Greek philosophers used to think that the vagina was a deformed penis. It was like, an inside-out sock. The right way around is a penis, the wrong way around is a vagina, of course. Good old historical misogyny. We still see it that way, right? It's nothing more than a receptacle in the minds of so many people still. In my book, I call the vagina Vajanti. Like an old-timey, movie heroine. But it's the way we treat it medically, it's the way we treat it in conversation, in language. Language tells you so much about how we see the world, and here's a beautiful example of how poorly we see the world from a vagina angle. And even say the thing like something as common as PCOS that we talk about so often. PCOS is polycystic ovarian syndrome. फोकस कहाँ है ओवरी पे. कॉन्सिक्वेंसेज क्या है PCOS के? मेटाबॉलिक कॉन्सिक्वेंसेज, एंडोक्राइन कॉन्सिक्वेंसेज, मेंटल हेल्थ कॉन्सिक्वेंसेज, कार्डियोवैस्कुलर हेल्थ कॉन्सिक्वेंसेज, वो सब गया भाड़ में. ओवरी है तो हम रिप्रोडक्शन की बात करेंगे. इट्स सच अ reproductive centric view of women's health. We never step beyond it. Pleasure is not on the map at all. You know, just the way we talk about the clitoris, it's got, I think it was in 1985 or something even later that they mapped out the whole clitoris.
You know, I must tell you, I thought Dr. Cuterus had like a clitoris element to it.
I've heard that too many times now. Maybe I should post like a
like an explainer.
No, like a combination of this. I'm going to find a story here. I will make one.
Honestly, I think the clitoris is such a powerful thing, and the fact that it's not celebrated more.
it's not, let alone celebrated. It's not recognized. It's an unsung hero. It's the Tesla of the Edison world. You know. It's the all representations of orgasms for women we've always seen. Sex and the City was a radically sex positive show for me. मतलब मेरे तो होश उड़ गए थे कि ये क्या चल रहा है टीवी पे.
But let's be honest, we were watching it on TV. We were just watching the City. They cut out all the sex.
इंटरनेट पे भी देखा है.
हमारे ज़माने में हमने बस And the City देखा.
नहीं, मैं हाल में देखा है मैंने. I would say in the past 10 years.
Okay.
And इतने radical, इतने forward representation में, what do we see? Bang, 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 toes curl, orgasm, everybody's happy.
Yeah.
That's not how it works. That's literally not how it works. For an overwhelming majority, like 80% women say they don't have an orgasm from penetration. इतना बड़ा number हम कहाँ 2000 साल में हमने इस बारे में क्यों नहीं बात करी है? It's just baffling to me, and of course it's more than 2000 years, but it's in the past 50 years or even less than that we're able to understand that the clitoris is, you know, the center of pleasure. It's just such a telling number of how badly we ignore this topic.
You know, I found it interesting when you start watching American shows where they depict sex, or movies where they depict sex. The guy would always turn around and say, "Did you come?" Right? Which I thought was really polite, because in India nobody cares. In India nobody cares.
The bar is so low.
The bar is so low.
It is so low.
That you don't have to lie, because he's not asking.
Oh my God. And like, you know, if somebody is actually even faking an orgasm, or you know, they're demanding the idea of sex and pleasure, ये तो खराब लड़की है. You know, character assassination for something as simple as pleasure.
And you know, I find that is a starting point for a lot of things that are wrong. Like one of the things that really gets under my skin, that makes me angry, is these regular judgments we hear from courts, or you know, this idea of, oh, then why does she, like, you know, she said yes, did she say no? Why was she this? Why was she kissing him? Why was she in the car with him? I mean, because women like pleasure.
Women are people, wow.
Yeah, the women are people, and that it's perfectly okay to want sex until you don't want it with this one particular creepy guy who turns out to be creepy. You can't tell until that point. So I think the failure to acknowledge female pleasure, that women of all ages, and this is so important, women of all ages, in their 50s, in their 60s, in their 70s, could enjoy sex, want pleasure, want sex that is pleasurable, is so alien to us as a culture.
There was this film that came out a couple of years back, Lipstick Under My Burqa.
Yes.
मैंने हॉल में जाके देखने की गलती करी थी, because I saw it in Allahabad, where I saw the reactions of people when there is the older woman, I think I think she's in her 60s or something, like, she talks about having a vibrator.
Yes.
And it's, मतलब मेरे लिए तो वैसे भी radical था, बहुत बड़ी बात थी, vibrator, oh my god, let alone मतलब उम्र तो बहुत दूर की बात है. The reactions I saw in the hall.
What were the reactions?
Character assassination of that poor woman. I mean, it's a fictional character, but even that was the kind of comments that were passed कि ये कैसी महिला है, and you know, just women are meant to be virginal and, you know, very sort of the Madonna whole dichotomy. The idea of a woman enjoying sex is equal to bad woman. And I saw that in there. You know, majority men in that theatre. I don't know why, but
it's about sex.
Very simple explanation. It's very unfortunate that such people are allowed to have such a loud voice and dictate how we see our bodies and how we live our lives and how we enjoy things.
Welcome to the patriarchy. It sucks. No, but you know, interestingly, that film, I saw it in the movie theatre myself here in Mumbai. In Mumbai, silence. Uncomfortable silence. Everybody was just like, you know, everyone's back was a little straight. It was like, okay.
If we pretend for long enough it doesn't exist, it will stop existing.
Do you think that the new generation of parents we have now are probably going to be more open with their kids when they talk about sex?
Dear God, I hope so. But it looks like, honestly, I'm not even talking from a Delhi-Mumbai perspective. I'm talking from an Allahabad perspective also. There's a wonderful lady who lives in my apartment complex. I saw her getting married. You know, like I've known her since that. I've known her for like 20 odd years now. She came to me about her 14-year-old daughter and wanted to ask me, "Kya ye menstrual cup use kar sakti hai?" And it filled my heart with so much joy that this is happening. Yeah. This is actually happening. I'm actually standing here, and this woman who I call auntie and I've been seeing for so many years is coming and asking me, "Meri beti menstrual cup, meri 13 saal ki ladki menstrual cup use kar sakti hai ki nahi?" So change is happening for sure, and I feel like as more and more women are getting empowered and are getting educated, especially in smaller cities, and are having a voice and are having a decision-making capability, capacity, the permission to make a decision. I can't believe I said that. But you know, they're allowed to do this now. And
there is research, and I love this research because every time, and as a journalist, I've had so many debates about population control, right? There is research that shows that the only way to control population, or to basically, and you don't need to because it's coming down in India, FYI, is by giving women access to information and access to healthcare. And every single time an Indian woman has been given access to these two things, which is the information on how to space out the babies, how to use the birth control, and access to the healthcare, which is, here is the birth control, here is for free, which it's available for free in our country. Every single time that happens, you have positive result. Across social strata, across religious lines, across languages, you know, whether you're talking about tribal women, you're talking about rich women, poor women, all of it. As soon as we give access to women, you can change everything.
I love that.
There is hard research to prove this, that you don't need to do anything else in this country to fix most of the problems. You have to educate and empower the women. But kisko karni hai?
But I feel like yahi do cheezein are going to change the world, and I truly believe we'll change the world. I know this generation will. The way these guys have access to information which we didn't growing up, the way these guys have, they've been told from the get-go, your voice matters.
Yeah.
तो बहुत बड़े होके पता चला my voice matters. You know, and that feeling of I can actually do something, these kids are growing up with it, and the kind of aggressive passion they have, I truly feel we're going to see more and more of these. And of course, you know, we're going to go way back in a lot of ways, like the US, but I think it's going to get better.
You know, I find it really interesting that apparently, and I was told that people who are dating now in their early 20s, sex is not as much of a big deal as it was when I was in my early 20s, which is a long time ago, where basically people are a lot freer with their bodies. They're a lot freer with the idea of sex. And they're able to somehow mentally separate the idea of sex and pleasure with, do I like this person? Do I want to continue to date this person? It's not the same thing. So this Madonna complex of, is he going to think I'm slutty? Will a one night stand actually end up in a relationship? Will he ever want to marry someone who has already had sex with him? Do you find in your conversations this change is slightly wider, or is it, can you tell me what your understanding is of that space?
I think people are getting more mature about relationships in general, not just sexually, but even love, marriage,
Yeah.
ये नहीं है कि अब शादी हो गई है तो चलाओ.
Yeah.
ये नहीं है कि I mean, of course it's still there, but मम्मी पापा ने ये लड़का ढूंढ लिया, compatibility ईश्वर जाने क्या है, you have to get married now.
Yeah.
Sexual compatibility is a criteria for people to choose a life partner.
Wow.
Now.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
Yet again, the bar is so low. But again, it's an empowerment question. People are allowed to make that choice now. It's also access and information thing that people know that you're supposed to look for these things.
Yeah,
And, it's not too much to ask for. And I feel like even in media representations, which is very influential to that age group, sex का हवा बन जो पहले होता था ना हो, that's really died down a lot, represent bra पड़ा हुआ दिख जाएगा. Like when I was in school, मेरे यहाँ तो यहाँ तक का collar button ऐसे बंद होना चाहिए था. If your neck was showing like this, some nun would come out of somewhere and grab you कि क्या चल रहा है, ये गर्दन कैसे दिखा दी तुमने, cleavage तो बहुत दूर की बात है. So now bra strap दिखना and TV serial में bra पड़ा हुआ है, या condom का ad. I've never in my whole life imagined कि मैं दिल्ली रेलवे स्टेशन के पास में एक बड़ा billboard देखूंगी. This is a condom ad.
Yeah.
I saw it right now. The only condom ad I've ever seen in my life before this in India was वो सरकारी एक आता था. There used to be this तोता.
Yeah.
Condom गाता था वो. That's the only other representation I've seen ever. And now we're putting it on a giant billboard. It's incredible. So absolutely the conversation has moved forward. People are choosing and have the ability to choose now, and it's going to get better. I'm very hopeful about all of this.
Yeah. I have this weird theory that the advent of supermarkets in India will lead to safer sex, because you can pick up the condom from the shelf and you don't have to ask someone to give it to you.
And online shopping.
And online shopping is massive. The toys, the lingerie, the information, the access. It's really interesting how the internet changes these things.
While researching for my book, I found out I'd never imagined that this would ever be there. India, the states of Orissa and smaller towns are the largest consumers of edible panties. Okay, I should laugh actually, it's kind of cool. Because internet. The internet made it happen. You can buy these things.
Okay.
Because otherwise you're never going to go into a market and be like, I want to eat undies, where do I find them?
I don't know, it's a journalist in me. I feel like there's more to this story. I want to know more. Did someone break down why this is happening?
I will put you in touch with whoever I found that from. I was speaking to some industry people.
I'm very curious.
And you can never... I didn't even know edible underwear existed 10 years ago. But
really?
When I was 20, I didn't know there was edible underwear. When I was 21, I knew there was edible underwear. But you would never think कि मतलब मैं बाजार जाऊंगा और मैं बोलूँगा I want to eat undies. Where do I find this, right? On the internet you stumble across this, you're like,
this is
can buy, available.
I read that, and apparently because you can buy lingerie and sex toys and lubricant, which is so important online, and it can come to you in a completely obscure looking box and they make it a point, the people who sell it make it a point not to put any of the branding on top, has really empowered the women of this country.
And not just the box, but even in your bank statement. It'll say some gibberish, it won't say sex toy, buy sex toys illegally.com or whatever.
So actually, this is, and I'm glad you agreed with me. The idea that lubricant is important and is not something. Again, it's like
if there were 4 sex tips I would give to everybody, the first would be lubricant, the second would be lubricant, the third would be condoms, the fourth would be lubricant again. Because so many people struggle with not getting adequately wet enough, even in this era of Cardi B and her songs, which, you know, there is again some sense of shame there, you know, I'm not doing my body is supposed to do this and I'm not doing it, so I'm inadequate in some way. Or even knowing that sex is meant to be slippery.
Oh, yes.
I can't remember where I read this, but I read somewhere that dry sex is very appealing to a lot of people because they've never been introduced to the concept of sex should be slippery. There should be lubrication, there should be moisture, and that's why it hurts so many people for the first time.
I mean, circles back to our idea of pleasure, right? That we communicate that sex is something that you conquer. But the idea that it's supposed to feel good for both partners who are supposed to enjoy it is just never communicated.
It again comes back to language and how we talk about it. Seal todna, you know, like uska to nahi, what is it? There's this very particular way they say it in the north.
I've heard peti pack, which I think is really offensive, which is basically like you've not broken the seal, so she's a virgin.
Tetra pack thodi hai. It's there's this idea कि वो used है. You know, all of that. It's and the best part of all of this is the hymen is not a seal. It already has holes and perforations and, you know, things in it. It's meant to stretch. It's not meant to. ऐसा नहीं है कि, you know, we've taken a piece of cellophane and gone punching through it. Because if that were the case, that means that the vagina has a cap at the end of it. Where is the blood going to get out of? How are you going to menstruate? And that is a medical condition called an imperforate hymen, where we actively have to go sedate this person, put a nick in their hymen so blood can come out. It's this, again, purity culture, of course, also, but the hymen is so prized. It's put at this odd pedestal when it's not even, it's not a dhakkan, again, it's not khulja sim, you know, it is already, it's a very common example is it's like a scrunchie. So it's surrounding the vagina, there's already a hole in it. And then it's also the fact that when you tear the hymen, it should hurt, as opposed to if you have enough lubrication, it will relax on its own. And, you know, as the vagina will relax and you will expand it as opposed to tearing it. That violence is what gets me.
Yeah.
Todenge.
What's the book about?
It's a lot of, you know, how an introduction to the genitals generally for everybody, but it's also a lot about the history of sex and the history of genitalia and the history of these things and the history of shame and masturbation and contraception and it's all the things I love. It's like history and sex and fun trivia and jokes all in one mishmash ki ye lo. The idea is to give a non-scary introduction to the science of genitalia to people. And the science of menstruation and the science of sex to people. Yeah. But just really chilled out. Like how you would sit and chat with a friend that way. It's not I've used a lot of storytelling elements in it, so it's all very like Vajanti. Or my favorite illustration from the book, which is there's a. Have you seen DDLJ? Of course, you've seen DDLJ. Everybody's seen DDLJ. I'm talking about contraception in this particular chapter, where there's a sperm which is wearing a little hat and holding a little ukulele, wearing those round wale glasses.
We're all Shah Rukh fans, so.
And then there's an egg which has a unibrow. And there's a babuji standing in the middle being like, "Hi, I'm contraception." You know, so it's that kind of tongue-in-cheek science. Sci-com, I suppose, yeah.
That sounds really exciting, and I'm so glad you made the trip and we had this conversation.
Thank
you so much.
It's been a real pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. Good luck with the book. Good luck with the podcast. And I hope we can see you around Mumbai again very soon.
For sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.